Very good afternoon, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for making time to be with us on this very interesting and timely seminar in various ways on Global Index of Economic Openness and particularly India's case study that we are going to discuss today. On behalf of Brookings India, Chairman Mr. Vikram Singh Mehta and Research Director Dr. Shamika Ravi, I, on my own behalf, welcome. I am very new to this place. Welcome you all to this wonderful discussion that we are going to have. We have with us two very distinguished scholars, and let me have the pleasure of welcoming first the speaker for the day, Dr. Stephen Bryan, who is Director of Policy at Legatum Institute, UK, London. In addition to overseeing the Institute's policy programs, his research focuses on socio-economic drivers of prosperity. He also leads the Institute's Center for Metrics, which hosts the Prosperity Index and other UK and international social and economic metrics. From 2015 to 17, Stephen was an advisor to the governments both in Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa. He has been a director at Social Finance, and he also advised the UK Department for Works and Pension, that is DWP, from 2010 to 2013. Prior to joining DWP, he spent 15 years at Oliver Wyman, where he was a partner and served a term as the head of its London office. He is board member of the Center for Social Justice and also of Social Finance Digital Labs, and a member of the UK Social Metrics Commission. He is author of Dynamic Benefits, the Blueprint for Universal Credit, and Outcome-Based Government. Thank you very much, Stephen, for being with us. Please join the dais. I also have a great pleasure in welcoming my senior at Brookings, Dr. Harsh Vardhan Singh. And many of us probably in this audience know him well, but I still would have very much like to introduce his distinguished career and achievements. Currently, he is heading a consulting organization. He is the chairman ICTWJ Advisors LLP, and he has recently been a member of the high-level advisory group on trade issues, that is doubling trade in coming times. So he's very much a part of the government advisory body, continues to be, and is also in a high-level committee which is working on the competition policy of India. Now, these are his current credentials, which means he continues working all the time. He has worked for over 3 decades on international trade policy, development, infrastructure regulation, and global governance. He is also a senior fellow of the Council of Emerging Market Enterprises at Tufts Fletcher School. He served as the executive director of Brookings India, so he was the executive director here, from August 2016 to December 2017. At Brookings, he brought in his wealth of expertise and experience on economic and trade issues. These added a whole new dimension to our research prowess. Prior to that, as the Deputy Director General of WTO, World Trade Organization, his direct areas of responsibility included trade in agriculture, services, trade and environment, technical barriers to trade, and electronic commerce. We have learned a lot from your writings, Harsh. In India, Harsha was economic advisor and then secretary of TRAI, Telecom Regulatory Authority of India. He has interacted with a number of academic and policy making bodies and continues to do so. Very warm welcome to you on the dais, please. Now, the order of the day is going to be the following, that we will have about 25 minutes of presentation from Stephen. and followed by only if there are any burning questions, please brief. Otherwise, we are keeping around 40 minutes of open discussion. So that would give Stephen priority. Unless there is something without which we cannot live, please do ask. But so we will have 40 minutes of very good discussion after the remarks are done by discussant Dr. Singh. So the title is Global Index of Economic Openness, India's Case Study, and I being one very much interested in this subject and have been working on it, but I am going to hold myself only while I am listening to all of you. The interesting thing about the discussion is that the World Bank has also come up with India being in the top improvers as far as the reforms are concerned, openness is concerned. The only other thing that I would probably have Dr. Harsha Singh say is about India being a United States of many states, United India of many states, country level size of the states. So state level work that is being done at the Ministry of Industry, in the Commerce Ministry on how the states are reforming, and something which my earlier organization NCAER does on state level investment potential, openness, etc., are also interesting. But today's topic, obviously, we are restricting to what, Stephen, you have to present. A very warm welcome, all yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rajesh, and thank you also to Brookings India for your generous hospitality. And it's great for us to be back again. Legatum had a great session with Sir Oliver Letwin here earlier in the year, so we really do appreciate the friendship and hospitality of the Institute. Now, I think as has been said, we have developed an index of economic openness, and I want to go back 1 second though to the prosperity index that was mentioned as well, because this really has been the starting point of our work. For the last 13 years, we have been publishing an index of prosperity around the world, taking around 150 countries and looking at as many dimensions as we feel are appropriate to capture a holistic view of development. And these include institutional aspects, they include elements of social well-being such as health and education and living standards, and elements of the economy. And the thesis behind this was that if we could set out in a pretty objective, pretty holistic benchmarking approach, an index that showed where countries ranked, showed how they were ranking, and what was the basis behind it, we could provide a bit more grist the mill of the debate about how do countries develop, which countries are doing best and why, how others could play a catch-up game, where the peers are, who should they look for examples of best practice, etc. With the idea that a little bit of competition, a little bit of sharing of best practice could be effective. And this has generated a lot of interesting conversations that we've had with different governments around the world who take this and then say, for example, in UAE, their health ministry benchmarks themselves against our health pillar. And they talk to us on a regular basis, what are other countries doing, etc. But what we found was that I think over the last 4, 5, 6 years, the area of economic openness is one that has become much more pertinent to the public debate, whether you think about the election of Trump, Brexit in Britain, the Gilets jaunes in France, and indeed areas of economic nationalism around the world. So we decided we'd take this approach that we'd built up through the Prosperity Index and apply it on a sort of narrower, more focused field. So we have built out, and we've published earlier this year, our global index, and now we are working through a set of what we regard as important countries to do more in-depth case studies, and hence today's event. Now, what we are aiming to do with the index and that approach is to take quite a broad range of indicators, published pretty well exclusively as publicly available data. So we draw from the World Bank Ease of Doing Business report, the World Economic Forum, the IMF, and many other sources. And what we also aim to do, though, is to try and structure it in a way that each of our elements are quite policy-oriented, and we aim to get multiple sources on each topic. So rather than just relying on the World Bank doing business, we look at what they are saying, we look at what the World Economic Forum is saying, we look at what the World Justice Programme are saying, etc. So we try to get a rich view of each policy area through multiple sources. And in that way, it avoids some of the gaming issues that one sees with, on the undoubted success of the World Bank Doing Business Index, is that it has been taken up and being adopted by many countries. Take Rwanda as an example, or a classic example of where it has been seen as a great success. It's very much a focus of Paul Kagame, but at the same time, there are those who argue there's been gaming of the system in that by having a small set of indicators, just sorting out the time it takes to get a building permit apparently gets you up the rankings, but it may not really improve your economy. And therefore, attacking this issue from multiple vantage points creates a more holistic, broader perspective that we believe is more accurate in the end. But that said, as we discuss each individual country and look at it in more detail, we know that we can provide an international perspective. We know that we are providing a pretty structured and holistic view. But as we talk about India today, as we were earlier this week in Indonesia, we also recognize that we're really missing 2 or even maybe 3 important aspects. One is the detail on the ground, and I'm sure, Harsha, you'll provide us with more of that as we go through. Second is, as we've just heard, there's a national level perspective and there's a regional perspective. And most of what we have access to and we've been looking at is the national perspective. And I'm sure we'll hear plenty of stories today as one leaves Delhi or Mumbai, goes elsewhere, a very different picture will be seen. The third is, and something I'd love to get feedback from you all today on, is this sort of a macro picture. If we've gone through all the different areas we look at and we've worked out, where does India rank, what are the issues, etc., what we don't have is a feeling on the ground for sort of what's the big thematic overarching issue that we should sort of organize our work around. So we've presented today, I think some of you got access to it and we'll certainly be very happy to distribute what is our draft report. And very definitely draft. We've put something together. We want to get your reaction, your feedback from today and elsewhere so that we can get into a good standard. We sort of deal with any infelicities we have. We get some more of the nuances so that when we publish, we've got something that you all recognize and is a helpful contribution to the debate. So that said, why India? At one level, it's a no-brainer. It is one of the biggest populations in the world, an ever-growing economy. By some people's projections, I mean, you can always sort of choose your forecaster. It may or may not be the world's biggest economy by 2050, but one way or the other, it's certainly one of the most important. So, for any global exercise looking at economic openness around the world, India has to be one of the most important ones. Just like as we were earlier this week in Indonesia, it's another large economy and will become ever important. Now, what's our approach? Let me give you a little bit of an overview of the structure we've taken to looking at what we mean by an open economy. We take 4 pillars and look at them each individually. One, market access and infrastructure. And what we're looking at there is how easy is it to generate and produce goods and services and distribute them to customers, both domestically and internationally. So we're looking at infrastructure, we're looking at trade deals, we're looking at how easy it is to get things in and out of ports, etc. Then enterprise conditions, which is around how easy is it to start a business, enter a market in a contestable way, what's the hassle involved in running a business in terms of the regulations, and what's the labor market like? How much access do you have to good quality labor? What degrees of flexibilities does an employer have in terms of the different forms of employment possible? Then the investment environment looks at the financing ecosystem. How easy is it to get access to finance, whether domestic finance or international finance? What sort of protections are there for investors? So good quality corporate governance, is there auditing standards so that as an investor comes in, they know that their investment is safe and secure. And then finally, underpinning it all, what's the quality of governance? Because at one level, you can have all those things. But if the rule of law isn't working, if governments act in a capricious way, if the government infrastructure and government services aren't working, a lot of these other nice things will never get off the ground. So they're the 4 themes that we work through in the report. Now, in different countries, obviously, different issues are more or less important. And part of really what I want to get at today is get a sense from you all, which of these ones is really the overriding theme we should focus on. Now, if I then look at India, what do we see? Very quick, this is a subset of our rankings, taking a few sort of local economies to compare it against. India comes in 57th in the global rankings. Relative strengths would be in enterprise conditions and governance, whereas relative weaknesses would come in under the investment environment. A lot of that is driven by restrictions on FDI, for example, and then market access and infrastructure, relatively speaking, the weakest area. And I think, again, we can all probably recognize that a nation like India is very still much playing catch-up mode in terms of building out electricity systems, water, transport, etc., versus some of the more developed nations. Now, the good news is, and this is a rather exaggerated graph, that India has gone from 10 years ago being 72nd in the rankings to 58th. And there's a bit of a hockey stick here, and I've had a look at it, and I wouldn't read too much into any timing particularly. There's a whole series of trends going in multiple directions that have caused that. But I think overall, you could say the last 5, 6, 7 years, very definitely seeing an uptick. So over 10 years, enterprise conditions have gone up 22 places. This is probably the big area of growth. So the ease of doing business very much got better. Governance up a little bit, hardly worth noticing. Likewise, investment environment, not really a change in terms of the overall rankings. And then market access infrastructure up a little bit. And in one level, at this stage, looking at it, we're sort of slowly peeling the onion. I would be saying, this seems to be the missed opportunity, that one of the areas that's most need to work on compared to the rest of the world and compared to your peer economies hasn't really made the progress that it might want to. So let me start then with we'll go in through this in more detail, a sense. Now, by the way, I think we've got this wrong. And what I want to do today is really have this discussion, and I'd love to get your feedback on this. So I'll put that down here. This is wrong. I don't know where it's wrong, but I'm sure it is somehow or another. Is that it seems to us that the strengths that we're seeing here, the enterprise conditions, the financing ecosystem, so the actual access to capital in terms of venture capital, stock markets, etc., seems pretty good. And governance, despite a huge amount of commentary and criticism about the government here, again, when you're looking at peer countries, it's a relative strength, other than some aspects of corruption, which we'll come back to. Areas that have improved, but we think could still do better, would be investor protection. For example, the insolvency and bankruptcy code has got better. We could say there's definitely movement in that direction, but more is needed. Likewise, contract enforcement. And then scale of market access is around, I'm sure we'll hear more from Harsha, is around the extent to which the free trade agreements are expanding now up to, I think, 19, according to our data. But what about the EU? What about addressing the GSP situation with America? These are real areas that could improve, particularly given where exports are going. And then areas that we think are constraints, things that probably are the most important issues holding further progress back, would be issues around foreign trade and investment, the need to improve infrastructure, particularly around communication and energy, and then the old bugbear of administrative delay is the fact that on many dimensions when we look at it, compared to peers again, the time it takes to do various things in India is slow. And that seems to be a little bit of a leitmotif running through. Again, love to get your thoughts on it. So if we focus then on the strengths, I'll run through these quick. I'm going to go through these slides pretty quickly, just to give you a feel for it, and we'll get a lot more out of the discussion. As we said, enterprise conditions. The burden of government regulation, as measured by the World Bank, has got quite a bit better, from 100th to 20th in the world. That is a fantastic improvement. The ease of starting business, albeit still at 117th, has improved from 141st. So we sort of see here, India has gone up quite a lot over the last 10 years. So this is tangible evidence from sort of public surveys of the effort the government has made coming through and being seen in these surveys. The state of cluster development, in fact, there's nearly 400 special economic zones, is really coming through as well as something that's been recognized as strength. And the reforms in the labor market, again, improving in terms of the World Economic Forum view about the flexibility of hiring practices, but also redundancy costs having reduced from, I think, around 56 to a reported average of about 16 weeks. Again, in a global context, that's a big improvement. So we're seeing that, as a small business owner, or even a medium-sized enterprise, the opportunities and the ease of doing business have changed quite dramatically over the last 10 years. terms of the financing ecosystem, again, a good strength. Banking is becoming more accessible. There's obviously still an issue around the soundness of some of the banks, particularly state-owned ones. But broadly speaking, what's really interesting, I think, is vis-a-vis peer economies, access to capital for small and medium-sized enterprises. While on the ground people may complain about it, versus other economies, there's a lot more risk capital available in India than in many other similar places. So that is, for us, and this is where I think it'd be great to get that sort of dialogue between the international perspective and what life is like on the ground. As we see it from the outside, that seems like actually a position of strength. The other area, quality of governance. This is one that's really interesting because you read commentaries about India's government, and it may just be a sort of a UK perspective that we're picking up. But the sense is, crikey, the Indian government, used to be fantastic, hasn't been invested in, it's all a bit slow, it's a bit complicated. And that may be so, and it may be an issue of missed opportunities. But again, when we compare it against other governments of countries that we would see as economic peers, it's actually pretty good. And there's actually there's a lot still to be based to build on. On the other hand, when we start to think about issues around corruption, that definitely is coming through. But it seems to be petty corruption as opposed to major corruption. So we think about sort of, obviously there'll always be a few, well-known scandals. And in the report we list several. But when we start to look at sort of international comparisons again, we see that it's issues around use of office for private gain, as opposed to major diversion of public funds. That's the issue. And a lurking issue of whether officials get sanctioned for misconduct. And again, lots of reports and data, which again, I'd like to get your thoughts on around the extent to which there's criminality within the public sphere. Is it really true that there's a lot of connection between the criminal acts and public politicians, and are there really that many politicians who are who have criminal records? Is that an issue or not? I'd love to get your thoughts on. I'll let you take the first share, Meng. Have you got it? Good. Yeah, sorry, yes, do. Yeah, sorry, I thought you had it. Yeah, take it there.
No, I thought that it could be secret.
No. This is all. I think we're not bringing anything here that isn't already in the public domain. I mean, we see our jobs as curators and to an extent interpreters. Not to say I want to hide behind it, nothing to do with us, mate, these are their figures, but to say this is not meant to be that revealing. It is very definitely a curation exercise. So in this whole space we've just talked about, what are the opportunities? Again, I think it'd be good to get your thoughts on the Competition Commission. Our sense is that it's made a lot of progress, probably could do with further strengthening. Is there an issue? Could we push further on licensing regulations? One of the things you see is if there's a high degree of informality in an economy, it still means there are barriers to entry that people are circumventing. So I'd always use that as a little bit of the canary in the coal mine. And at the moment, I still think there's probably work to be done to enable firms to enter the formal sector, and for entering the formal sector to be a sensible and practical decision for small enterprises to do. Strengthening bank soundness, I don't think, is a fantastic and new idea of ours. Governance, again, I think these are all fairly well-articulated views in the literature around maintaining anti-corruption efforts, deepening government capability, and I think then strengthening regulatory regimes. Something about the relationship between the regulators and the courts that we're starting to pick up around the courts perhaps having to do more work in issues that perhaps regulators could be dealing with. Again, love to get your thoughts on that as we go forward. So, next theme, improving but could be better. Investor protection. So, when you look at the data, and I think this is something that could be very definitely is an issue about things being probably out of date. If you look at the data that's been recorded, the insolvency recovery rate and the World Economic Forum's view about the insolvency framework are both quite critical at the moment. But I would expect that in a year or so's time, with the IBC having been passed, having been amended, that as we see in a couple of years' time, that should be quite different. So that's not an area I'd necessarily be sort of worrying about at the moment, given the legislative progress that's been made. Quality of judicial administration has improved, which is good, alternative dispute resolution mechanisms have also improved. But again, help us on this one. My understanding is that Prime Minister Modi has said that he'd like India to become more of a centre for alternative dispute resolution. If that's the case, I think there's a lot more work to be done. It's going to be good to get a sense of that on the ground. Now, we'll hear a lot more about this in a minute. We were discussing this beforehand about what is the real trade-weighted tariff in export. Well, this is actually export markets rather than import markets. But
markets you export.
Yeah, markets you export to. Because if you're saying, one thing you want to do is get out there, get more exports. And how is India faring out there? Well, one issue is that in export markets, because of the lack of reciprocal free trade deals, India faced quite high tariffs out in the markets. And there was a big spurt of growing access to markets. What we do here, and this is probably one measure where we've actually done our own calculations using World Trade Organization data, we've said, let's look at the free trade deals and regional trade agreements, et cetera, that each country has, and in effect calculate what share of world GDP does a country have, as it were, privileged access to, and have a look at that and say that's a good measure of what's the sort of the size of the second order market. If the first order market is your domestic market, the second order market is that amount of world GDP that you have privileged access to. And it's about 12, 13% of world GDP that India has privileged access to, so with the 19 agreements. A country like Indonesia has about 50% more again. Go to places in Latin America and it's 3, 4, 5 times as much as, not quite 5 times, but 3 or 4 times as much as that. So there's a real gulf around the world between certain regions that have really expanded their access and others that have quite a bit of work to do. So let's acknowledge the improvement, but say this is one area, definitely think more work's needed. So these would be the opportunities there. I think we've talked about them. I think the big one is probably the EU and dealing with taking a view about how to address the US situation. Now, as we are sitting here live, we may or may not have an example in the next few hours of Britain succeeding to have a deal with the EU. So I think we're very familiar with how difficult those negotiations can be. So we sort of, we're with you and understand that it's a long haul, but worth it in the end. Okay, I'll just quickly, got a few more minutes left, go on to the constraints then. So flip around the other side of this, foreign trade and investment. So there are, again, documented in the report, and I think there are others around this room who are far more expert than we are about the nature of the restrictions of FDI and of financial transactions. But just to suffice to say, versus other countries, this is definitely some grit in the machine. And then the other piece we would say is the tariffs that are imposed on imports, particularly of raw materials, intermediate goods, etc. And again, by I think it's the World Bank data, but we can check. When we look at the share of imports that are free of tariff duties, that's just one. There are many ways of looking at this, but one way of looking at it is how many imported products come in free of tariff duties, and it's about 13% for India. Contrast that with Singapore. Singapore is an exceptional case, but a lot of your Southeast Asian competitors are pretty high up there as well. You're having a very different attitude towards imports. We've touched on infrastructure before. Let me just sort of give you a little bit of data on that. Energy, water to an extent, and communications, critical parts of having strong infrastructure to allow the entire country to operate and produce competitively. First measure we look at energy capacity. How much energy, how much electricity is being produced per capita as a sort of simple benchmark for the amount of power that's available. And if you think about energy as being one of the critical drivers of economic development. Now, I think countries like the US, the UK are probably getting over a hump on the other end where actually there's a form of dematerialization, de-energization, that's a very bad word, but you know what I mean, going on, and actually using less energy per unit of GDP, even less energy per capita in certain circumstances. But most countries that are very much on an upward curve and sort of need to come up and then probably go down again. And I'd say there's a lot of work to be done here for India. One of the issues you see as well is the subsidy question. And it's sort of odd at one level to be, I'm saying this as an outsider looking in. I know there are huge numbers of socioeconomic reasons for a lot of this, but it's odd at one level to be in a situation whereby you're not producing a huge amount, you're subsidizing demand, and then having blackouts. There's sort of economic signals aren't working as well as they could when the distributors are in effect not given the right economic incentives to invest and to get a return on their investment for improving their distribution systems. I did a lot of work in Saudi Arabia on reducing their energy subsidies. So I appreciate quite how much hard work it is. It is a politically and economically very, very challenging thing. But I would say that that probably is one big issue that requires getting the right coalition together, getting the right level of sort of social compensation to allow that to work so that we're getting proper market signals in. I mean, likewise, not that the mobile is necessarily subsidized, but there's again a capacity issue in mobile, where actually now there's pretty widespread access, but the raw amount of bandwidth that's coming through is not yet sufficient to allow for sort of a broader digital economy taking place. And finally, the sort of treacle in the system. What I did, I went through a range of different measures and sort of picked up, in many cases, people talk about time to do this, time to get a permit, time to get a license, time to register property, time to get stuff through port, and just looked at that across the piece for India and found a recurring pattern, which again, I'm sure is no surprise here. But whether it's administrative proceedings with the government, resolving commercial cases in the courts, time to get an electricity connection, I don't have time to register a property, but you'll know what the answer is, time to comply with border regulations and procedures, really important thing for trade. In each case, there's a little bit of an outlier here, which I think, there's a theme here which is worth exploring. What needs to be done to accelerate the process? So under this area where we think these three areas, but I really want to get your reaction to this, are where the most binding constraints are. So around foreign trade and investment, getting the infrastructure right, and finding a way to get rid of the treacle in the system. So that's my time is up. I just really want to throw that out for reaction. As I say, we think we've got some good structure, we've got some good objective international views, but we know we've got the details wrong, and we'd love to have a discussion debate from you on how to get it right. This is only yet a draft report, so this is a really good opportunity for us to clarify where we are. Thank you.
It just shows how moved I am by this presentation. No, I was trying to make space. Thank you very much, Stephen. It was truly wonderful, both to get an advance copy of your report and the discussion we had, short discussion before this, and the presentation. I want to congratulate you for this very important effort. It covers multiple areas. It's trying to combine a lot of information which exists in a coherent, useful manner. And I just thought, I have not really spent too much time thinking about the details. I've been taking notes, and I'll respond to some of those points. I worked on my flight yesterday and this morning. So I prepared something just to start the discussion, and then some additional comments. The product is laudable. However, you have given us some opportunity to try and see in what way could you improve it further. And I will just grab that. So I took this. Is this my chart? Yeah. Just to start with this, and I looked at the various rankings here, and all these areas are very, very important areas. But I started with investment environment because in my mind, anything which generates investment or attracts foreign direct investment, for example, that policy is providing incentives which are moving in the right direction, because nobody puts their money in a place unless the operational content is going to give them a return. So that's the part which you need to address for market issues. And the other thought which struck me when I was reading your report and your presentation, that when I looked at index of market openness, my first thought went to the Washington Consensus. And that was for market opening. And all the knowledge subsequently is that one has to be market enabling. And market enabling is substantially different from just opening your market. And you are actually talking about market enabling.
Very good point.
Yeah. So if the market is enabled properly, then the investment environment should also be good. And here, India is 76th. Then I've just very quickly made some tables. Let's go to the next one. Excuse me? Yeah. Oh, I have to do it? Okay. How do I?
Want me to do it?
Is this the one?
Yeah, leave one.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying.
You can try to switch it now.
Now? Okay. Thank you. Yeah, here. So I took the top 20 economies in terms of inward FDI. India is number 10. The rank was way different in investment preparedness. And we can see that here. So in 2018, it was 66. It has improved to 57. This is the openness index, and investment environment index is 76th. Which doesn't mean the index as constructed is wrong. It's just that it's based on certain things which do not adequately capture what is driving FDI. So there are additional aspects to consider. One could be that maybe India is a very large economy. So a large market, people want to come invest in it. And India is the 7th largest economy. And you have very high ranking for economies which are actually not very large economies also. So size is not the only factor which matters. So this is, the first column is somewhat complicated because it reproduces information from the previous table on rank for FDI and investment environment. The brackets for the countries show the rank in GDP. This is the amount of FDI which came in. Latest figures from UNCTAD. This is the GDP, which is from World Bank. And I just said, okay, let me divide the FDI by GDP. So I get these numbers. India is 1.54. A number of large countries, in fact, the top two got a lower share of GDP in terms of the FDI which came in. And Hong Kong and Singapore, poster boys, got very high shares. So, they are really attractive. And that's where the policy environment becomes very important. So the enabling part, they are very good in that term, but there are other aspects which I'll show you later. All the countries whose names are in bold, their share of FDI was less than India. And they include US, China, France, Germany, Italy, South Korea, Russia, Japan, Saudi Arabia, Switzerland. So in terms of GDP, India's FDI is not that bad, actually. So there's something else which we need to look at. So here, what I've done is, I've got the top 20 countries in terms of economic openness. And I'll explain why I'm showing all this later. And I've got India, which is not one of those. Its rank was 66. Then others, which were also comparators in other tables, etc. So you see that one of the statements I saw in the report was that there is a strong correlation between economic openness and the economy doing well. An economy does well when it has high level of competitiveness. And openness, a lot of people associated with trading across borders. How open is that? And very rightly, your index has looked at both the price issues as well as other factors. And interestingly, if you see the ranking of trading across borders, some of those you'd feel should be doing very well have a low rank, because the procedures actually charge a large amount of money to get the application through. So you have, for example, Denmark, Netherlands, New Zealand, Australia, not as high as you'd expect. So one has to go into the detail to understand where the action point is. So when you look at the overall index and you say, hey, there is a correlation, actually there may be a picture where you feel there is a correlation, but things are changing in such a way that the overall picture remains as if there is a correlation, but different components are changing. In terms of policy making, as a policy maker, suppose I have to make policy. My first thing is, okay, economic, what does it mean? What do I change? Where do I act to get the result I want, which is a strong economy, growing economy, etc. So one has to go to the next level for that. And here is India. In terms of, now I talked about the border, we talked about trade. So you have, in terms of rank for world trade, goods and services, as an exporter, India is number 11, and that's a competitiveness indicator. But for merchandise, it's number 19, while as an importer, it's number 10. So obviously, oil plays a big role there. But the point I'm making is that India is one of the top 20 exporters of merchandise and top 10 exporters of services. And this doesn't capture trade in services, because if you go deeper into trade in services, there are 4 different ways they are actually exported, including through FDI, consumer going to another country, tourism, and a natural person. So if I'm a teacher, I'm a doctor, I go to another country, provide my services, those earnings are exports of my country. So I said, okay, what does this index mean? So I have organized the top 20 countries in terms of the index. And I said there are 4 components. Let me see how much the index rank for each of these varies with my final result. So where it says 0, it means the rank is the same as the overall of index. If it gives you a positive number, you add that to the rank. So if, for example, I have 10 for investment environment for Switzerland and 5 for the overall index, the rank in investment environment is 15. If that rank is lower, I add the negative number. So if I have -1 enterprise condition for Switzerland and 4 there, so Oh, that 10 plus 4, so 14. That rank is 3. You can see for various countries, the range is quite large. For example, for Luxembourg, from -11 to 9. For Australia, from 10 to -11. So obviously, a very disparate picture is being put together. What does this mean when I put it all together and say, this is economic openness? And this links up with competitiveness. Or this links up with a strong economy. So obviously, one needs to then get key items, priority areas, which you have done actually. Which you have done, because you've gone to the next level and you have identified the levers which should be pulled. But I think there should be some recognition of this fact that you're working in a world where you're trying to combine very disparate things. Was it all? Yeah, I think so. So this background was to just share with you the landscape of where we are coming from. Your practice of sharing best practices is immensely useful. If you organize that in conceptual categories to guide what kind of situations can you really, have you seen these practices work, that will be even better. And I think this will be a major service to policymakers. And you're absolutely right. What I try to do is to look at the detail on the ground in some way, to check the robustness of the message which is coming through. So one has to be more tentative about the message. One has to be more detailed about the message. And that's where your priority areas becomes key. Of course, qualitatively, the index is a good idea, because over time you see, okay, in general you have improved here, but then what do you need to do? On India, EU, US, FTA, etc., I have some thoughts of mine which I've written down, but I'm first responding to the ones you raised right now. I think EU is definitely a doable FTA. Some efforts will begin again, in my view. Doable only if both sides try and recognize one major fact, which has been seen, for example, very palpably in the RCEP negotiations, that a comfort factor has to be created to first get somebody on board and then move that entity towards a result, which is the ambition. So you don't lower your ambition, you just delay it. It's a bit like what US promised under TPP, which it got out of, that my certain auto tariffs I will fully implement to zero in 30 years. So that's a huge comfort level which it wanted. The largest economy in the world, it got it. It didn't join that agreement, but that is the way to go through with it. And also some kind of early harvest, the kind of practice with Japan and US have just begun by agreeing on certain things and continuing with their discussion. So whatever is feasible, harvest it. The other thing is that services market for access for exports, actually you can have a possibility of selling in markets abroad, but ability to sell depends also on the regulatory coherence which exists. And for services more than goods, and for goods it's very important, regulatory conditions are extremely important to get access. So just having open markets available to you doesn't mean you are actually able to export services. What you have to see is how much services are you actually exporting. And there could be various reasons for it, including the regulatory context. In fact, in TTIP, which is negotiations between US and EU, two of the most advanced economies, they haven't managed to get their regulatory system together so that they feel comfortable with each other. I saw one item of your data on energy subsidies, 10% of GDP. I don't think that's accurate.
Yeah, that's not correct, because you have put us on 98. On energy subsidies, it is 140. In fact, our pump prices are higher than that of QS. So
Not just that. I was checking. You might be thinking I'm looking at my mobile phone. I was just checking what is the total tax revenue as share of GDP.
So including taxes,
So
the prices are much
the
higher.
budget aimed for 16%. In actual fact, it was 10.9%. If 10% is just energy subsidies, the deficit financing should be huge.
Yeah,
So,
let's go back to the IMF on that one then.
yeah, absolutely,
Even
absolutely.
for energy capacity at 98 number, energy subsidies at 140, I mean, these are two.
So these are examples of whatever you are using, you must test it in terms of consistency with other aspects. Because if you don't do it, your very good work, otherwise, your 99% will be spoiled by just somebody identifying this and saying, oh, this effort is not worth it, while you have made a very good effort to get things together. So the other,
This communication side also, the mobile data speed is at 130. So I don't know, I mean, like,
no, there I think there's, since I've followed this to some extent, and I've experience of it, the Indian situation is very poor.
4G works, in fact.
No, it doesn't work in my home.
It works as much
So-
as it works in Europe.
So no, it does not. I just came back from Europe. I go to Europe very frequently. In fact, that's where I was traveling from. No, it does not. Maybe you are luckier than I am. But I actually took additional connections with new service providers. So I covered 3 of them, 3 large ones. I won't name them. And then I said, there's one number I've got now for 21 years.
But 130 is too, I mean, lower. So that's the,
No, it's not satisfactory. It's not satisfactory. In fact, I also go to Banaras a lot. It is abysmal. Delhi is not India. So this is one area I think we do need to strengthen our abilities, and it can be done. We shouldn't be just waiting for 5G. It can be done with a bit of investment. The commercial problem there is, and this is where is the crunch. And to some extent, I'm also responsible for that, as you will testify. We created so much competition in this market that the prices came down very low. Therefore, average revenue per user became very small. And when you have, our model was that instead of margins, we should try and focus on volume and returns. So to the extent you need investment to augment capacity, that investment is strained for the firms. It's not huge investment, but it will mean increasing prices, and even if you increase by 6 paise or 10 paise, there's another competitor waiting in the wings to undercut you. So that is the problem for India today. But in actual fact, it's affecting performance. So I think on the qualitative message, you're right. The quantitative one, you may or may not be, but that's something. The other point which you mentioned, Rajesh, that a lot of the action is at the level of the state. So it's very useful to also look at the states. So you have a combination of central policy and you have a combination of state policy. If you could include some discussion on states, that would be very useful and take you in a more comprehensive manner. So the notes which I had written here were that estimates should be tested in terms of what the ground situation is. The trade agreements India has, and most of them, the modern ones, date since 2005. Actually, the difference between the current trade agreements and the Indian trade agreements is that India is very wary of tariff opening. And CPTPP effectively reduces to 100% of the tariff lines. In the beginning, it's between 90 and 100 for different members. So that's the kind of thing which, in a political sense, for India is very difficult to accept right away. So again, the flexibilities approach becomes important. With EU, it has agreed to 95%. So, with China, it would not be happy with that much. So it's a question of how you manage a difficult situation, and it's not very easy to just enter an FTA and get it done. You enter an FTA with US, and you actually have a situation where the other side just hammers you with demand, and you are unable to get too much of your own demand through. So, and this is, it characterizes the US approach with all the FTAs it has done, including USMCA. So, then as far as I've already talked about standards, you have talked about priority areas. It might be a good for your future reports. If you combine with some surveys, maybe Brookings India could do one such thing for you. Which of the policies actually have a larger impact than others, and which are the low-hanging fruits? So these are two very important ways of improving the impact of policy. Then on factual points, actually you talk about India has huge number of problems with high tariffs, tariff quotas, etc. I mentioned this to you earlier. Tariff quotas means a particular trade policy. It's a tariff rate quota. India has only 4. Small ones for agriculture products. India does not have quotas mainly other than those to meet its international obligations. So quotas is not the primary instrument of protection. You can have anti-dumping duties. I mean, India is one of the largest users of anti-dumping duties. You can have implementation in certain way of sanitary, phytosanitary measures, trade barriers to trade, etc. But if you really think about the implementation of these in other economies, large economies, it's not a model for openness. But the focus on that is very small because of other factors which come in. So on quotas, I think India doesn't really have, you should not find fault with India on quotas. You can discuss the tariff issue. On tariffs too, I had done some calculation. Another way of indirectly calculating trade-weighted average tariff is you take the customs duty, total customs duty collected, divided by my merchandise imports. And 2 years ago, I got a figure of 2.3% or 2-point-something%. Last year, I calculated it was 3.2%. The US 2 years ago was 1.6%. So the trade-weighted average is low. The issue is of peak tariffs. And you're absolutely right. In fact, your slide on zero tariff trade caught my eye. I checked it. Your data is broadly in the right place. But India has 70% of its lines have between 0 and 10 tariffs, which needs to be corrected. I mean, you have a tariff of 2.5%. That's what a nuisance tariff is. you should make it zero. You should reduce the number of tariff lines, etc., which are there. So all those are required, but at the same time, because of FTA, so there is one situation where you have an FTA trade, and there is another one where you have MFN trade. MFN trade tariffs are on the higher side. So on subsidies, again, your report strongly criticizes India for subsidies. I don't think India is that much of a culprit if you compare it with some of the economies which are not so criticized. And in that context, you know, in the subsidies of India as a whole, I looked that up. One estimate said it's 1.6% of GDP. Okay, 2%, 2.5%. In terms of just agriculture subsidies, two of the largest economies in the world, they give about $80 billion of subsidies recognized as subsidies in WTO. There are other forms of subsidization also. India's subsidy level is less than half that. The problem with India is, and when I say problem, not as a policy problem, etc., that its objectives require institutional structures to stabilize incomes for farmers, to stabilize the market prices, to keep a buffer stock for food security, which is an important objective. And from an international perspective, it should not be used to destabilize international trade. One can argue that everything does destabilize it, but because they don't have several of these institutional structures, they have ended up subsidizing. With direct benefit transfers, this process will change. So if you want you said, what's the large kind of message about India? So India has brought change in its policies substantially. It still needs important efforts to go on. It is taking strong steps in that direction. The test for this is, and that's where your governance part comes in. I think even if you implement good policy and you don't implement it properly, if you delay, time is also cost. In Austrian economics, time is capital, actually. You are creating uncertainty, you're creating additional costs, you're losing opportunities, and you're weakening the economy. And the time taken for most administrative things, not at the border though. At the border, India is now almost as good as Vietnam, although your chart shows Vietnam worse than India. I think, in fact, it's the other way around. It's now nearly 2 days at the border, just slightly above that. Yeah. Yeah, fine. I'll just quickly go through this. So the other thing is that I think one of the aspects which openness concept or enabling concept captures it a bit, but has to be stated, is that the experience with new industrial policy shows that it's not just about creating conditions. It's about creating conditions through active intervention. And that becomes even more important due to one factor which perhaps your next report will look at: technology. The whole concept of openness will change with digital technology. And when you combine it with new scientific advances in transfer of data and production, it'll be a different production paradigm. And any country which is not prepared adequately for that will find it extremely difficult. In fact, the latest world competition report says India loses 10 positions because others have implemented technology. So technology is something which you need to take into account. Also, in certain places, you have mixed up two concepts of property rights. One is IPR and one is property itself. So I just, yeah. You also say India is weak, the weakest aspect is India's investment environment, extensive nature of restrictions on international. India doesn't restrict international investment so much. If the investment comes in, all the permits which are required are difficult. So one has to distinguish between, yeah. So it takes time. No, it takes time. It takes time because these are at the state level. That's why I said.
As you said in Austrian economics, time is money.
That's fine. But you see, when I read investment restrictions, there is an investment policy. And India's investment policy is not restrictive. However, ease of doing business, which focuses on these other things, there India needs to work and improve its situation. So, conceptually, if that's the case, and if it was so restrictive, it wouldn't be the 10th largest recipient of FTI. I won't go into new industrial policy. There's a whole list of issues which come up there. But there's also, there were some charts where you pointed out India has improved a lot from say 100 to 40, etc., which is a very good thing. But my thought was, is it still above the threshold or how much below the threshold is it? And that again requires a comparator. So now for the rest of the discussion. Thank you very much.